Hello and welcome everyone. This is the Creator Space Online and we will be looking at digital cinema camera settings and formats. So it's a exciting session that's really more technically specific, but nonetheless, will be a really fun experience at the same time. So what we're going to look at today is digital cinema camera settings and formats and specifically getting it to work that way. So what does all of this mean? It means that video has a lot of options, and I think that's the really fun thing. There's options, but also at the same time, there's the ability to control these options. And that's the whole thing, is that what we're really trying to showcase and teach is that you can manually control these tools and the cameras and the equipment to create exactly what you want to do with it. So I think that's really the harnessing the power and control over the camera to understand what different things can do, and we'll provide some tips and advice on the best way to make that happen and work as well. So that's what we'll be doing today. So let's get right into this. So I just want to thank all our partners. So we have the Canada Council for the Arts, and we have our library partners. So we have the Blue Mountains Public Library, we have the Collingwood Public Library, we have the Wasaga Beach Public Library. So all these library partners are vital to providing the digital arts computer station. So that's where you can do all your video editing. But at the same time, the camera we're talking about today is available if you have a library card at the Blue Mountains Public Library or the Wasaga Beach Public Library. So we're really excited to be able to partner with the libraries and provide that information on that. So what does it mean? So the camera access is there. Well, all that we require is for a proficiency test to happen, and that's just an online test so that you can go through the camera and get familiar with all the settings. But also by attending these workshops, and you can rewatch the session, you can gain a valuable understanding on how a lot of these camera tools and settings work as well. So today we'll look at the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K kit. We'll look at digital arts equipment loans, what's available through our library partners, and then we'll quickly just touch on that proficiency test to make sure everyone's good with that. And finally, some of the basic settings. So we'll look at frame rates, ISO exposure, then we're also going to look at the formats and aspect ratios as well. So that will take us through that, really a good overview, solid overview of the camera, what it can do, and how it works, so that you can feel confident and comfortable accessing the equipment and making it work as much as to how you want it to work. And I think that's really important. We want to make sure that that's exactly what's happening with the equipment, that you're in control of it and you're getting it to do what you want it to do in terms of getting the right settings out there. I think that's really, really, really important. Okay, so how does digital arts equipment access work? So the Creator Space, through our partners, we consist of projects that are, the Creator Space project consists of workshops, digital arts computers, and digital arts loan equipment. So the digital arts loan equipment is what you can get through the libraries, through technology loans. And the great thing is, all that you need is a valid library card through any of these three library partners. The workshops you're attending right now, then digital arts computers, these are also available at all three library partners. And those are iMac computers that are specifically set up for digital arts use. And they're 27-inch iMacs, there's 2 in each library. And you can just go and access those as during library hours. Digital arts loan equipment, generally there's a lot of equipment you can take out without any proficiency test, but it consists of video, sound, photography, and lighting equipment. And each partner library has different sets of these equipment, and you just need to have a library card. It's just like taking out a book. Now, the library membership rules apply, and some of the specialized equipment, such as the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera kit, requires a proficiency test to access it as well. And that proficiency test, once you can finish that proficiency test, you can access this kit through the Blue Mountains Public Library and the Wasaga Beach Public Library. Now, the kit consists of the camera, media cards, batteries, and 4 times manual prime lenses. So manual meaning that you control the exposure through f-stops, and and you're in total control of that with the lenses. So they're not autofocus or anything like that. So they're all manual focus, manual exposure. Additional equipment you can consider: video tripod, sound kit, microphones, and the LED lights with stands. Now, the video tripod and the LED stands and the LED lights, you don't need a proficiency test, so you can take that out. So if you already have a video camera, you want to just take out a tripod or lights, that's also available too. So I'm always helping to promote and want to make sure that everyone's aware of what's out there in our Creator Space project and what you can access. So it's really exciting. Proficiency test, you go to tbmcs.ca, take the online cinema camera proficiency test, and then once you finish that, we get your information and we add you to the list so that you can access the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera from either the Blue Mountains Public Library or the Wasaga Beach Public Library. So that's the really exciting thing. So great access, great camera, amazing tool. But again, there's these supplementary pieces. So if you just need lights, you just need a tripod, feel free to do that as well. But this camera, if you haven't used it before or you aren't familiar with 4K, a great tool to get started, a great way to experiment, try things out. And there's no harm in trying things out, even if it doesn't work out properly right away. You'll get to learn it, you'll get to understand it better, and that's what we're going to look at today. How do we use this camera, and how can it work? So here's some of the intro statements or the phrases that we're going to discuss. So frame rates, that's really important because that's always a big question. So these are the setting things where you start to get into, and I can't give you the correct, there isn't a correct answer. It just comes down to, okay, these are kind of best practices. This is what's traditionally done, but you might find that you want to use totally different frame rates or totally different shutter angles and work with specific ISOs. And that's great because that's the experimentation part. You might come up with a real specific look with a different combination of these. So frame rates, that's the first setting. How many frames per second, such as 23.98 or 5994. So that's how many individual frames are you capturing per second. And it's really simple to adjust. So I'm just going to go to the camera right here. So what we'll see here is on this side over here, it says frames per second, 23.98. So you can simply touch that. It's a touch screen, and that's the cool thing. Touch the screen here, and now I can shift this 23.98. I can make it 24, 25, 29.97, 30, 50, 59.94, 60, and that takes us to the end. So those are our options there. So those are all the different frame rates. So you can use different frame rates. Now, what is the right frame rate? So I love using 23.98. So, why do I like using 23.98? I always find it has a great cinematic look. It's a lower frame rate, so it doesn't take up as much data necessarily as higher frame rates. And it's a little bit different than, traditional kind of video use, which would be more on the 30 side. So these fractions, why are these fractions? Why do these exist? So these are basically sync modes that in our video monitors, our TV sets, and the transmission of broadcast television required frame rates to not be exactly 30. So our frame rates originally, all of our NTSC, so our North American frame rates, are based on 30 frames per second because we have 60 hertz in our electrical currents. So the TVs are synchronizing to our electrical currents to be synchronized, but they need a little bit of a synchronization moment. So they're not a true 30 frames, they run at 29.97. So a little bit of a complicated scenario, but so what happened is when shooting film, the traditional frame rate is 24 frames per second in film. So video for television was 29.97, film was 24. But to make 24 match to 29.97, you have to do a little bit of magic. And so you need a slight slowdown to 23.98, and then you can convert it specifically to 29.97. So that's the kind of the idea there. So if you shoot 23.98, that is basically the kind of international standard for digital cinema. It works really well, and then you can speed it up to 24 if it's being shown in a theater. A lot of theaters can just play at 23.98 as well. So anyways, a big roundabout answer, but that's the idea here. So if you're looking to do something that's kind of in that traditional film area, you'd want to shoot 23.98. You can shoot 24 exactly if you want as well, but it will usually, you'd want to output then to 23.9 eventually. So it's just nice to shoot in 23.98. Then if you need to shoot and for international standards, or maybe for a specific look, you want to just have that look, you can explore 25 frames per second. Now that mode is PAL, and that's more of the European standard, and that's based on 50 hertz power. And it's the cycles are basically repeating each frame twice to show it, so you get 50 hertz, 25 frames per second, so half of that. So that's how they came up with that. Now, with the advent of HD, more frames were desirable. Let's have the more frames, the crisper action can be. And what do we see on large screen TVs? One of the big bases for live television are sporting events. Lots of action and movement. So higher frame rates help with that action and movement. So we get to 5994. So that's that 2997 times 2, 5994. So a higher frame rate, less motion blur, very crisp image, and it's a little bit of kind of more realistic or hyper realistic. There's also the straight 60 as well. So if you want to shoot straight 30, straight 60, not really sure why exactly you'd want to do that, but if there's a reason, the camera lets you do it, so you can explore with these different frame rates. And the great thing is once you're editing, Blackmagic DaVinci Resolve Studio software or the free version at your home, so we have the studio software available at the Creator library partners in those labs with the computers. So the computers are there, that software is there for editing. It can open any of these frame rates up. So it's never an issue for editing with it. So it just, the higher the frame rate, the crisper the action is. The lower the frame rate, you get a little bit of that artistic blur, that kind of what I call the cinematic look. So experiment. I can't really tell you what the right frame rate is, but that's something for you to experiment with and see what is the right frame rate. So that's what my take is on frame rates. Okay, so ISO, that's the sensor light sensitivity. The higher the ISO, the less light is required for exposure. So this camera can go from 100 to 35,000, I believe is the ISO. It has a dual native ISO, and it switches from basically 400, goes 100, 200, 400, 800, I think there's 1,000, and then it goes to 1250. And that's the next sensor's native ISO. And at 1250, it becomes clean and crisp. So you kind of want to use the lower side from about 100 to 800. Then if you need more light sensitivity, you want to boost up to 1250. And then that can take you all the way up to 35,000. So how does that work? So back here with the frame rates. So I can take us out of the frame rates. I push that again. We're back here to the main screen. Again, it's all touch screen. And I go over here, and you'll see over here it has an ISO. And I'm going to touch the ISO. And here you have the range, so you can go all the way down to 100. So we start here at 100, and we can move our way up to in thirds of a stop. So you see 1,000. You can see the little bit of grain showing up on the screen. Watch what happens when I go to 1250. It disappears, and that's the dual native ISO. It goes to a better version of the sensor's light sensitivity. So now we're at 1250. So that will look a lot nicer. It's not going to have all that noise. And then we can go all the way up. We can keep going up. And you can see the noise comes back. And we go up to, the final one, sorry, is 25,600 ISO. But a lot of noise gets introduced. But this is really for, ultra low light. You don't have a lot of light. I typically, would go up to maybe like 8,000-ish or something. You can see a little bit less noise. It's a lot more reasonable of a camera in that fashion. So yeah, so that's just the light sensitivity. How much light do you need to expose? And what's the rule there? So there's a lot of different things, and we talked about in different workshops, but the higher the ISO, if it's a darker room, you want higher ISO. If it's a brighter room, you could have lower ISO, down to even like 100. Outside, exterior, 100 might even be too bright. Then we got to look at neutral density filters, putting them on the lens, making things less bright. So those are the things to think about there. So the ISO is tied to your depth of field. So if you have a lower ISO and you open up your exposure or the lens aperture, you get a shallower depth of field. And sometimes we like that look. Like the look you have right now, you can see this camera capturing this camera. You can see that everything's out of focus in the background. So that's a shallower depth of field. If I increase the ISO and change the exposure, then I get a greater depth of field. So that's what this ISO is about too. And you might also want a higher ISO specifically for grain. Maybe your project, you want to see grain and noise. So that's something to think about. Intentionally making an image a little bit deteriorated in its ISO. So there's, again, no exact answer. You need to use this, but it's all about proper exposure and making things work for your image and how you want it. So that's the whole settings area in the ISO. Okay, now going back here. So if we look at shutter angle, so that's the angle, and so this is a mirrorless camera, but the shutter angle is kind of a virtual shutter, and it's based on that mechanical shutter idea, and that really is the concept that there's a metal shutter. It would go in front of the negative as it's getting exposed and spin around, so that it would have time for the film to move. So each frame gets it gets held, it gets exposed, and then the next frame moves up in film. So it spins around and exposes the film. So, and that shutter is then closed as the film moves to ensure that you get, it's basically exposed, closed, shutter, exposed, closed, shutter, exposed, closed, shutter. And that has to happen 24 frames per second, so 24 times per second. The traditional shutter angle, to make this long story short, is 180 degrees, the shutter angle. And that 180 degrees helps to, make that shutter spin. It was more of a practical purpose because if you imagine the shutter would be, think of like a semicircle. So if it's like, if I'm straight like this and it's like this and it's spinning, and it spins around and it closes. So that's the 180 degree shutter. It's like a half circle, right? And then you're spinning, closing, so that it can move the film, and then it's spun, and then it's on the open side, so it exposes the film. And then it spins, the film moves, finishes spinning, and then the film is there to expose the next frame. So it's a very complicated process. So what we can use the shutter angle for is to deal with different things in motion. And typically I just say leave it at the 180 degrees. That's really all that you would need. Shutter angle also can refer to shutter speeds, but it's really not applicable to video. So that's the kind of equivalency of when you think about photography. Shutter speeds are similar to shutter angles, how much time the image is getting light exposed to it. So that's kind of virtually what it's doing. How long does that frame get exposed for beyond just the 1/24th of a second, for example, if it's 24 frames per second. So anyways, lots to talk about there, but here, let's look at the shutter angle. So what can we do there? So we can go to the shutter angle, which is right over here, shutter, and you can see it says 180 degrees right now. I can press on that, and I can change it. You can see there's some settings here. Now, the reason there's some of these presets, these can be used to help alleviate different issues. So flickering lights, if lights are not working well, they can sometimes flicker. If we go all the way up to this 359 or almost 360 degree shutter angle, that means we're getting rid of the shutter. And what it does is it gives you a little bit more light exposure as well. But it does add a bit of motion blur because you're not getting that time for the sensor to kind of be off, if you will. So that's, and then at the same time you can close it up more and you get kind of a more strobe-y thing where it's kind of less sharp and a little bit artistic. So we can use these for artistic purposes and technical purposes. So going up higher will usually help reduce flicker from lights and things like that. Going lower can intensify kind of strobing and add this kind of different look. If anyone's familiar with the film Saving Private Ryan, they played around with different shutter angles for those battle scenes, especially the opening one, and gave different feels. So, they would shave out shutters and make them smaller, like 80 degrees and things like this to add different effects. So this is really an experimental aspect. I would say just leave it at 180. That would be the best way to start. That is some good advice I can give. Just work at 180. That gives you that kind of standard mode to work with. Then go to 360-ish and stuff if you have any issues technically. And you see what you see is what you get. So in this monitor, if you're seeing something weird, you can always look at that shutter angle and see if the shutter angle can help reduce, flickers or weird anomalies in lighting or effects or aberrations that are happening. So that's the shutter angle. Okay, then the next one, exposure. So the amount of light that's allowed through the lens, and that's measured in f-stops. And that is basically, like you're taking the lens, and you have these, you have the exposure here. So you're just basically going from this one's a where is our exposure here? So it's a 1.5. Go a little bit here, 1.5, and you can go all the way to 22. And that's basically just opening it and closing it. And I might be able to show it through the back here. So if you see it like this, so you can see it's opening and then it's closing. So it's all the way open at 1.5, and 22 is closed to a little pinhole. And that's how we adjust our exposure. So that's another setting. And because we're using manual lenses, it's all done on these actual lenses. So it's not done through the camera. So that setting isn't in the camera. Typically, if you were using an auto lens mode, here's where it says iris, and that would be your f-stop. So you'd be able to adjust it there. So if you use like another type of lens on this camera that does have that auto exposure settings or digital control of the f-stop or the aperture, then that would be show up here in the iris mode right there. That's where that would show up. So just that's always interesting. Okay, so those are those main settings, and I think that's a really great setting tools. That's the real essence of the settings in terms of getting things going. But then we get into this area here. So there's multiple formats that the camera can record in. So we have HD, and so these are the resolution formats of the frame. So we talked about frame rates, how many frames per second. We talked about the ISO, so the light, the sensors, sensitivity of light, the how much light is going through the lens, the shutter angle, like how much of that shutter angle is being used, how does that work? And now we get into the multiple formats. So we get into HD, and that's what we really see typically. Most screens, your phones and things like that. This is the full HD that's called as well, 1920 by 1080. So that's a format. Then there's the UHD or Ultra HD, and that is a bit of a different format, but that one is based on 3840 by 2160. So that's the Ultra HD format, and that's what we're seeing now in 4K TV. So at home, your home 4K TV is this UHD mode. So that's technically what it is UHD. Oftentimes it's called 4K as well, but technically it's not 4K because 4K means something else, which is the next one. 4K DCI is 4096 by 2160, and the camera can do this mode. And this is the cinema mode. So it's a digital cinema initiative DCI, and these format ratios or these format specifications are what digital cinema has set up. So when you go to a movie theater, and the 4K DCI is what a lot of films are projected in digitally, so it's 4096 by 2160. It's just a little bit different to deal with what is a traditional film aspect ratio of 185 to 1 versus the 178 to 1, which is the next thing I want to talk about, aspect ratios. So we can do 16 by 9, which is that HD aspect ratio. It's also equivalent to 1.78 to 1. And we can also do 2.4 to 1, which is that widescreen look, which is really cool as well. So a lot of, when you see like action movies, a lot of those films will be like the latest James Bond. 2.4 to 1 is that widescreen cinemascope look, it's called as well. And that gives you that black bars on the top and bottom within the 16 by 9. But it's not so bad now, because in the past when there was like a 4x3 box, when we were like using that square image, then you put 235, you have this tiny, like there's more black than there was picture. But now the 2.4 within this HD frame, like you're watching here now, if I put bars on, it's pretty reasonable. So that, the bar would be kind of like here, and then, it's not as taking up the whole image. So we'll look at what that means. Okay, so how do we do the formats? So to get to the formats, we need to go to our menu, and the menu button's over here. Hit menu right there. And here you can see it has all these different formats. So typically, you can see there's the 4K DCI mode that this camera's in. There's the 4K 2.4 to 1 There's the Ultra HD. So you can just basically press on these whichever one you want. So you can go to Ultra HD, you can go HD. Even has this 2.8K anamorphic, so it's a bit smaller, 2.6K, 16:9. So if you want a little bit more than HD, you can shoot in 2.6K. This is the HD. So, but traditionally we'd just be using the 4K, Ultra HD, and the HD would be kind of your main three to look through. Now, there's a little bit here too. So Blackmagic RAW, I recommend using that format, that codec. That's the wrapper that all this information is put into. So the file becomes a Blackmagic RAW file. And here you can decide how much compression. And the more compressed it is, 12:1, you can fit more data on the card. The less compressed it is, the higher the quality is, less noise, but you'll fit less on your media cards. So what does this look like? So let me just get out of this menu. So here's the regular HD mode. I'll go over here. Here's the 4K, and that's this mode. And what it does is it will actually shoot this bar on top. It will actually shoot with black. The image doesn't take up the whole frame. It actually shoots 2.4:1. So when you're editing, it adds the black bars in editing, and it gives you more data on your cards because you're shooting about 15% less of a frame. So let's go back to that. What does that look like? So the actual spec of that is 4096 by 1720. So instead of 2160, it's 1720. So you save a little bit. That just shoots basically the black. So it kind of crops that sensor to shoot 2.4:1. And then we have the 4K DCI. If you are specifically going for cinema, you'd want to do that. But otherwise the Ultra HD is here. There's this one. So, and you just go through those modes. So again, experiment. I can't tell you which one specifically you should be using. And same with the aspect ratios. It comes down to, how do you want to tell the story? So again, this kind of typical full frame mode. I'm just going to go to the monitoring here and turn this frame guide off. So that kind of full, let me see, it should be able to, oops. There we go. So that gives you the whole, that's that frame. If I go over here and I go to the record mode, 2.4:1, it will just be shooting in between. Let me see if this will show us. Yeah, there you go. So see the black bars on the top and bottom? That's all that it's going to expose. So this is it records nothing here. So it actually shoots that 2.4:1. So it saves some space. So that's always some good advice, so you can save some space. And here's the 4K DCI. We'll see now it takes up the whole frame. There's that one. And then there's also like these modes here, which are the 2.6K anamorphic. Same idea there, right? It just shoots that black bar. That part of the image isn't used. So that's always really cool. And then these ones are just traditional 16:9. So that whole frame again. So that's what ends up being exposed. So those are your aspect ratios and your formats, and there's things to consider. I would try different things. Look at, trying that 2.4:1. I think it's a great format. Trying the 16:9, the Ultra HD version. And if you're going to be going to film festivals, or you're going to project in the theater, or you just want a little bit more resolution, you can always do that 4K DCI mode, and then you can just zoom in a little bit in the edit and adjust for that if you don't need that whole area. So it shoots, that's the full sensor's size, is the 4K DCI. So that's the native sensor size. Everything else gets a little bit cropped as it goes down in the size of that. So that's a lot of great information. I hope that will help to answer a lot of questions. We've been getting a lot of questions on these the formats and aspect ratios and setting up the camera. So that's how you can get through the camera really quickly. Those are those key settings to get you going. Turning the camera on, getting the media in, but then those settings can be a little bit like, oh, there's all these settings. What am I supposed to do with it? And I think, again, the real key thing there is if you can go out, you can experiment with it, try these different combinations out, maybe a high ISO with a low frame rate, you want a little bit of noise, maybe that 2.4 wide aspect ratio with a lower ISO, you want to shallow depth of field. You can combine all these different looks. There's so many combinations, and there isn't really one that can be right for you. You might also want to do a project with multiple frame rates, multiple aspect ratios. All of this is more and more possible because in the editing side of things, it can deal with it. It can do the recalculations and playbacks, and it works really smoothly. So gone are the days that could be really complicated. You can totally look at this as an artistic expression, capture it any way you want, and Blackmagic DaVinci Resolve will be able to ingest it and stick to one specific frame rate, and it's going to interpolate all those different frame rates, if you will, to that common frame rate. So if you want to be mastering in, let's say, 23:9:8 or 15:9:4, you can shoot any aspect ratio, any frame rates, bring it all into that same project that could be, a final UHD 4K 16:9, and then you just play with what that project will look like in the future. And it can play back any kind of frame rate. So that's a really exciting thing, and I think that's the great opportunity that the software lends us as well. So you can try these things in the camera and then work with it. So again, we've had some, last week we did some sessions on the Blackmagic format, 4K, the Blackmagic RAW. So I encourage you to rewatch these, and I'll also be posting these onto our YouTube channel shortly. So stay tuned for those. And also, if you're interested in cinematography and you are a member of any of the library partners, there is an in-person cinematography workshop starting in March. So it's 4 weeks and Wednesdays. And I encourage, there's space is very limited, and it will be a hands-on digital cinematography workshop where we'll be exploring some more of these ideas and looking at how different things work. So hope to see you there. And following that in April, we'll be doing a production workshop as well. So if you haven't checked out what's available coming up, do go to our website, tbmcs.ca, proficiency tests, workshops, and you can always email me, tom@tbmcs.ca, with any of your questions. Happy to answer them and talk more about digital arts. So again, thanks for joining me. Hope that was an informative session. And again, you can rewatch it from the same link. It will be available just shortly after we finish. And I hope to see everyone soon. So thanks again to all our partners, Canada Council for the Arts, our library partners, Blue Mountains Public Library, Collingwood Public Library, Wasaga Beach Public Library. Please don't forget to check out the digital arts computers available at all these libraries, and the Blackmagic camera kit is available at Blue Mountains Public Library and Wasaga Beach Public Library. So have fun exploring these concepts and techniques, and remember to stay creative. All the best.